You're standing atop a jagged section of stonework, the wind off the northern steppes pressing into your face like a hand trying to guide you home. Below, the world slopes away into dry brush and jagged rock. It's dawn, or close to it. The air is dry. It's just where you live, where you're stationed, where you eat. You are tired of millet. The guards around you shift their cloaks and mutter in quiet tones, chewing on something tough, something salty, something familiar. This is the Great Wall of China, though, to you. It's not the great anything. It stretches across dynasties and dust. It is not a single project, but a task repeated again and again, an architectural ritual more than a structure. During the Ming Dynasty, construction took on an especially brutal pace, with entire communities uprooted, conscripted, and resettled along the wall to serve and supply it. This section, in particular, is part of the Ming-era restoration. Somewhere around 1450, you've been up here for 3 months. In winter, the stone radiated a slow, dull cold. In summer, it reflected heat like a polished skillet, but the diet that stayed the same. Stored in heavy clay jars, sealed with wax or mud, a sour crunch to start the day. The common soldiers made do with tofu gan, soaked overnight and grilled with a bit of oil and green onion if supplies allowed. The Great Wall is not one wall. It is hundreds of walls, rebuilt, reinforced, repurposed, and feeding the soldiers along its 13,000-mile expanse. That was a logistical nightmare of remarkable tedium. Most days, it tasted of ash and old firewood. Each garrison had its own storage granaries, walled and guarded as fiercely as the men themselves. If they did, the penalty could be fatal. Miscalculations were not treated lightly. It was said that a corrupt or careless quartermaster might lose more heads than a battlefield general. Rations were counted in advance. Extra food was rare. Spoilage was a constant threat. Food was as important as bricks. The typical garrison soldier woke to a routine that changed very little throughout the year. Wild garlic, pine nuts, mushrooms, and even small game hares, hedgehogs, and birds were occasionally cooked over open fires. The stew might be flavored with mountain herbs or simply boiled in water and eaten with a bit of stale bread. Remote outposts survived on millet porridge flavored with salt and, on good days, a drop of sesame paste. Foraging too far from the wall was dangerous, not because of predators, but patrol protocol. A soldier caught wandering too far could be whipped, fined, or worse, presumed a deserter. There were even recorded incidents of mold being scraped from pickles and reused, not rice too delicate for dry climates, but millet, which could be boiled into a porridge, ground into flour, or hardened into portable cakes. It was cheap, abundant, and easy to transport. The morning meal, millet and pickles millet, was the foundation of nearly every meal on the wall. With it came swencite, pickled vegetables, turnips, radishes, mustard greens, sometimes fermented cabbage. Tea was boiled bitter, sometimes spiced with ginger, if you were lucky. Protein came rarely. Sometimes bits of salted meat, usually pork or dried fish, would be cut into porridge for senior officers. And yes, oil was counted. Supply chains on the wall, feeding thousands of soldiers, required planning months ahead. Convoys of mule carts and oxen moved slowly along rugged mountain paths. Food administrators, called liangguan, had a simple job: don't run out. The further the garrison from major cities like Beijing or Xi'an, the worse the food. Wild additions, soldiers often supplemented their diets through foraging or informal trade with local villagers. These moments of shared stew and stolen spice were precious and risky. Still, the smell of wild onion roasting in goat fat was sometimes too much to resist. Food as morale. It's worth remembering that food was not just fuel, it was rhythm. A bowl of hot porridge in the morning was a comfort. The planting was rotated. Guard duty was shared. One week you stared into the mountains. The next you watered cabbage. A shared jar of pickles at night was a ritual. In these small things, the soldiers found continuity in continuity, a kind of peace. There are records of garrisons growing their own vegetables in nearby fields: peas, beans, cucumbers. Meals structured the day. During lunar holidays or visits from inspectors, a feast might be assembled: stir-fried greens, dried fruits, candied hawthorn, perhaps even roast duck carried carefully from the nearest town and quickly devoured. Dawn, boiled millet and pickles. Noon, cold leftovers or flatbread. Evening, hot porridge, again, sometimes with broth if stocks allowed. Banquets were rare but not unheard of. Storage, spoilage, and salt. Without modern refrigeration, food preservation was everything. Salt was a cornerstone, not only a flavoring agent, but a preservative for fish, meat, and tofu. Storage cellars dug into mountain rock were sealed with wooden doors and packed with straw or ash to absorb moisture. You chew slowly, listening to the clang of a bucket as someone draws water from the storage cistern. Breakfast never has. Even with care, spoilage rates were high. Rats and mold were constant companions. In a particularly telling detail, some records show that soldiers were issued lime powder to sprinkle around food stores, an early attempt at pest control. So, here you are again. The sky is lightening. The morning fire is out. A bowl of hot millet rests in your lap. It smells faintly of ash and vinegar. You wonder how many bowls of this you've eaten, and whether tomorrow it will taste any different. Because while the world may have changed since your arrival, let's return now not to the wall itself, but just behind it, a little downhill, past the barracks and storerooms, where a line of blackened chimneys pushes smoke into the winter air. This is where food happens, in the kitchens. It was often a separate structure, built with thick clay bricks, windowless, and partially dug into the earth to trap heat. The air was thick with the scent of boiling porridge, old grease, and occasionally something more appetizing. It was not a glamorous role, but it was a powerful one. The man holding the ladle could influence the mood of an entire garrison. The kitchen in a Mingira frontier garrison was not a cozy place. You may imagine a bustling space full of cooks, but in truth, many meals were prepared in silence, punctuated only by the scrape of ladles against iron pots and the hiss of wet millet hitting hot oil. The cooks were soldiers, two assigned kitchen duty by rotation, rank, or punishment. Rationing and the imperial supply chain. Each soldier, depending on rank and post, was issued a daily ration. For a common soldier, this consisted of 1 to 2 bowls of boiled millet. A portion of pickled vegetables, dried goods were everything. Fresh food was a luxury that arrived rarely and vanished quickly. Occasionally, bean curd, either fresh or dried, a small ladle of broth or salted soup, depending on the weather. Hot water or bitter green tea. Officers and overseers might enjoy a portion of dried meat. A boiled egg or rice, considered a more refined grain, transported from more fertile southern regions when available. These rations were calculated not just for nutrition, but for shelf life and transport weight. It could be eaten fresh, pressed into hard cakes for travel, or fermented into a soft, pungent paste called furu, which doubled as a flavoring agent when spices ran low. Imperial supply logs from the Ming archives show detailed lists: 7 jugs of pickled radish, 13 sacks of yellow millet, 2 carts of salted duck eggs, 4 bundles dried cabbage, 6 stones of coal. This was the language of empire: jars, sacks, carts, bundles, stones. The unsung hero. Tofu. If there was one food item that quietly kept garrisons functioning, it was tofu. Tofu was light, protein-rich, cheap to produce, and surprisingly adaptable. There are records of garrison cooks combining tofu with finely chopped wild garlic and frying it into patties using the residue from animal fat left over from monthly meat rations. In times of scarcity, the same tofu cakes might be boiled again, flavored with pickle brine and thickened with flour. Upon thawing, developed a spongy texture that absorbed broth like a dream. This early frozen tofu became a staple among mountain garrisons: fires, stoves, and the slow boil. The fuel, whatever was nearby: charcoal, dried reeds, twisted branches, or, in hard times, dried dung. Food was boiled in huge iron pots, some heavy enough to take 2 men to lift when full. The porridge boiled slowly, sometimes buckwheat if a trader passed through, sometimes with green beans, often with nothing. Water was drawn from cisterns, slowly filtered through cloth to remove silt. It was heated daily for drinking and sterilization, flogged once and reassigned to latrine service. And if something went wrong, if food spoiled or an ox cart didn't arrive, it was the cooks who were questioned first. There are preserved military reports describing punishments for kitchen neglect. Cooking was serious business. An extra chicken might be boiled, eggs cracked into the porridge, a dried orange or a slice of preserved plum laid carefully beside a bowl. Festive food and forgotten feasts. Despite the dull repetition of daily meals, there were occasional breaks, times when food reminded soldiers they were still human. Lunar festivals, imperial birthdays, or the arrival of a traveling inspector might result in a wall banquet. Wall banquets were small affairs. Sweetness was rare, but when it came, it was revered. Brine was poured over stale rice to soften it into edible porridge. Centuries later reads, the Chinese believed spoilage was caused by a disruption in Kenergiand, thus both a practical and moral failing. This plum is small and older than my blade. Cooks waged quiet war with the rodents, burning sulfur to fumigate cellars, scraping nests from thatched roofs. Yet, for 1 hour, I am emperor of flavor. One anonymous diary from a junior officer simply states, on these days, soldiers would write home, share pickles from personal jars, and tell stories about foods they hadn't eaten in years: fresh lychees, street dumplings, the smell of roast lamb in markets far from the wall, food waste and the mice of the wall. Vegetable peelings were dried and added to winter stews. Crumbs were collected and mixed into flour cakes. Spoiled food was reported, often blamed on spirit rot or wind mildew. Meanwhile, mice thrived. Rats and field mice were regular companions in granaries. Soldiers set traps made from horsehair and wooden buckets, baited with dried mushroom stems. Still, the mice came. There are even stories of soldiers taming mice, feeding them pickled cabbage scraps in exchange for company on long, cold nights. Too much favoritism could cause dissent. Too little could breed silence. He waits by the stove. He has a crooked ear. He knows when the millet boils. The quiet politics of soup. You've been assigned to kitchen firewatch, stirring a pot of millet for the next day's breakfast. Even soup could be a battlefield. Extra oil in a pot. It might go to the officers' quarters. A fatty piece of dried fish, saved for the messenger who brought dispatches from Beijing. The allocation of ingredients was a subtle game balancing fairness with hierarchy. It's said that in one garrison, a cook was removed simply because his broth lacked discipline. Food reflected order. It had to. Now, night is falling. The wind has picked up. The walls around you are thick. The pot is heavier than it looks. Outside, the moon hangs low over the steps. You think, not for the first time, about what food tasted like before the wall, and whether, when this duty ends, you'll ever taste it again. The pot is nearly empty now. Steam rises in thin spirals from the last scoop of millet, scraped from the bottom where it thickens into a film that clings to the iron. Your arms ache from stirring, but there is comfort in the rhythm. There were times when even millet ran out. Scarcity, a kind of peace in doing what must be done. The wall held its breath, because food on the Great Wall of China's, especially during the Ming Dynasty, was never just about survival. It was a slow, daily negotiation between empire and wilderness. These soldiers remained at their posts, between order and chaos, between the central court's commands and the hungry bellies of the men who guarded its edge. Its brine had turned. It was eaten anyway. There was no wheat flour, no pork, no ginger. In return, soldiers traded cloth scraps, forged tools, or news. But he read the instructions aloud during festivals, adding his own commentary, describing each step as though the dumplings were forming in his hands. Times, merchants, craftspeople, and families of soldiers all contributed to daily life. Food became a way to preserve identity. Among the garrisons were men from southern China. They pickled vegetables, dried tofu, spun noodles by hand when wheat was available. Some made a living running small kitchens, serving cabbage, dumplings, or stewed beef tendon to off-duty guards, far from their home provinces. Their dialects were different, so were their tastes, of course, triggered by flooding in the Yellow River Basin. Several garrisons along the northern frontier were cut off for nearly 2 months. A man named Liang Yu kept a folded piece of parchment with him at all times, a handwritten recipe for Zhao Longbo, written by his sister. Official records describe molded flour bricks being rationed out with thin vinegar broth. Soldiers reported splitting dry tofu cakes into quarters to last the day. Famine was not a regular occurrence, but it was not rare. The further the wall stretched from fertile plains, the more vulnerable it became to disruption. Bad harvests, as memory banditry, or the simple misfortune of a collapsed bridge that kept supply carts stranded for weeks. In such moments, during the Great Famine of 1483, one anonymous report reads, "A jar of cabbage was found behind the west storeroom, and yet, cooking for one southern guard, he could not make them, and the others listened gratefully." This practice was common. Cooking became storytelling. Stories became flavor. Through words, memories were seasoned. Trade and the taste of the frontier, while imperial supply chains brought in the bulk of garrison food. Not all ingredients came from official sources. Soldiers on the wall often interacted with traders, Mongols, Hui Muslims, who brought dried fruits, nuts, flatbread, and sometimes spices like cumin or peppercorns. It's believed that cumin lamb, now a hallmark of northern Chinese cuisine, may have been born in the garrison kitchens, an improvised stir-fry of mutton scraps, garlic, and foreign spice, cooked on open flame. A rare indulgence, a triumph of trade over restriction. The role of women and civilian kitchens. Not every meal on the wall was cooked by soldiers. In larger garrison towns or permanent settlements along the wall's better defended stretches, civilians lived side by side with the military. Women, especially, played key roles in food preparation. Their cooking brought variety, a softness to the edge of empire. And during holidays, women organized communal feasts. These were less about abundance and more about ritual bowls, arranged in even numbers. Dishes symbolizing fortune, longevity, strength, a hard-boiled egg, a turnip sliced into coins, a stew made from 5 grains, each humble and each sacred. Illness, digestion, and medicinal meals. Food was medicine too. A common concern on the wall was digestive weakness, often brought on by cold, stress, and a monotonous diet. In response, garrisons employed simple medicinal porridges based on traditional Chinese dietary therapy. These porridge blends might include millet with hawthorn berries to stimulate appetite, sticky rice with goji berries to strengthen vision and vitality, buckwheat with dried orange peel to ease bloating and reduce cold hot water with fermented soybean mash. To help with fatigue, one Ming physician stationed temporarily along the wall noted that a warm belly yields sharper eyes. Food was not just energy, it was strategy. Departure meals and farewell dinners. Soldiers rotated home every few years if they survived. These meals were not large, but they were rich in meaning. Sometimes a special dish would be prepared using saved ingredients or contributions from multiple men. A stew with dried mushrooms, sticky rice sweetened with brown sugar, even rarely a small roast duck. The departing soldier might leave a pickle jar behind, filled with the vinegar brine of their last ration, a symbolic gesture of what had sustained them. The meal was often eaten in near silence, and when the bowl was emptied, a final toast of warm tea was offered to the wall, to the garrison, to home, wherever it was. Legacy and taste echoes. Today, few visitors to the Great Wall think about what people ate there. They climb the stone steps, take photos, admire the views. But beneath the stone lies a memory of flavor, the residue of thousands of simple meals, boiled and shared in the cold. Modern Chinese cuisine still echoes these histories. Tofu hot pots, sour pickles, millet porridge for breakfast, or behind a kitchen door, or beside a storage jar, half full. Cumin lamb skewers in market stalls, sticky rice balls with orange peel in winter. Each one a quiet echo of meals eaten on a watchtower, sealed months earlier, opened on a frozen morning by a man far from home. A final reflection, and so the question remains. How many empires were held together, not by generals, but by porridge? They sought warmth, a full belly, a reminder of life beyond stone and silence. Their food was not fancy, it was not memorable, but it mattered, and in that, perhaps, it still feeds something in us. You are not a soldier, not a senator, not a poet or a philosopher. Sometime in the 1st century CE, the sun is not yet up, but the streets above are already stirring. A baker stokes his oven. A fruit vendor arranges figs with sleepy precision. The cobblestones glisten faintly from last night's rain and other things. You are a man with a shovel. It's dawn in ancient Rome. You descend a short flight of stone steps, the air thickening with every footfall. A rusted grate groans shut above your head, and you're enveloped in darkness. Welcome to the Cloaca Maximarome's grandest sewer. Water was a tool of civilization. They built aqueducts that arched for miles. The floor is a mix of mud and worse things. The Cloaca Maxima was part tunnel, not because it's special, but because it's the only one that fits in this part of the tunnel without catching on the ceiling. You made it yourself from an old wagon spoke and a bent cooking fork for a day. The cloaca has its own ventilation system, but sometimes pockets of methane build up. A single flame, and your eyebrows might vanish. Sometimes it's debris. Sometimes it's something more organic. You try not to think about it too much. They're meant to catch the worst of the garbage before it slides into the system. Dead rats tied to your waist when you go into narrow side tunnels. In case you slip, in case the water rises, in case the tunnel swallows you whole. Broken pottery, a sandal missing its pair. These things pile up and choke the flow. You clear them carefully, prying them loose and bagging what you can. Life of a sewer worker, part canal and part mysterious underworld. A canvas sack and a leather hood to tie around your face. It helps, not enough. It wound beneath the city like a buried river, fed by countless smaller drains, bathhouse outflows, and public latrines. Baths that gleamed with imported marble, and fountains that gushed cool water into crowded forums. It stank, and it needed maintenance, and your place of work. Though you're a free man now, barely, the great drain of Rome to the Romans. But for all this elegance, something had to carry it, away the waste, the runoff, the detritus of over 1 million lives in one overgrown city. That burden fell to the Cloaca Maxima, one of the oldest engineering projects in Roman history. Built originally in the 6th century BCE, it also flooded. That's where you come in. Your official title is Foricariusa, cleaner of latrines and drains. But most just call you Cloacarum service, or sewer slave. You arrive at your post early. The city's waste doesn't wait. You carry a short-handled rake, a bent shovel. You begin by checking the great iron bars sunk into the stone, then deeper. The Cloaca Maxima is no narrow pipe. In some sections, it's tall enough to stand upright. The walls slick with algae and soot. You keep moving. Tools of the trade, your rake is your most prized possession. You also carry a small oil lamp, but you don't light it unless necessary. For larger blockages, you carry a hooked rada harpago to jab and prod whatever's causing the stoppage. The most dangerous tool you own. A rope. The smell of empire, you might wonder. What did it really smell like? The truth is, everything. Ammonia from urine, rot from discarded food, sulfur from decomposing waste, grease from bathhouses. Occasionally, the sharp tang of wind dumped by a tavern or spilled in a drunken brawl. But every now and then, a breeze carries something so foul, so fresh, that you gag all over again. Your nose adjusts, eventually. Your sense of smell dulls. And still you work, because you must. Companions in the dark. Men with bad knees, bad lungs, bad teeth. They move slowly. Speak little, but they nod at you in the dark, and that's enough. You're not always alone. Other workers join you for part of the route. Most are older than they should be. Then there are the rats, always present, always bold. They scurry behind your feet. Sometimes they swim, and sometimes they float. They watch from ledges. You eat quickly. Your hands never feel clean, even when washed. Cracked amphory bones, coins, a woman's earring. Once you found a whole statue head, eyes blank, mouth open in surprise, as if it too had slipped in accidentally. You've seen everything down here. You left it alone. Food, breaks, and a breath of air by midday. If you're lucky, you break for food. Above ground, somewhere in the shade, you unwrap a small bundle. Flatbread, maybe some olives, dried fish if you managed to trade for it. No one wants to sit too close. The smell follows. Your wife keeps a basin of vinegar water near the door. You soak your feet in it before entering. It helps. You can hear the footfalls of crowds above. You kept it. You still have it, wrapped in cloth. The muffled roar of a public debate. The roll of wagon wheels. Children in the street pinch their noses and laugh. You're used to it. Lantern low, a little. But because it proves you exist, why the work matters. Most of Rome never thinks of you. The senators dine, the orators speak. The generals return from Gaul in triumph, and all the while the cloaca flows silently beneath them. You think, sometimes, that it's better that way. The temples, the courts, the markets, everything would reek of stagnation. Because if the sewers stopped, Rome would stop. Baths would back up. Latrines would overflow. The empire depends on a river of filth, and on you. Echoes in marble sometimes, walking beneath the forum. Once, a coin dropped from a grate and landed in the flow beside you. A silver denarius, polished by time. Not because it's worth much. So, you keep walking, shovel in hand. The water slides past your boots, warm and endless, and in the silence, a question lingers. What does it mean to hold up a world no one sees? You've scraped another blockage, clear. It was roots, this time, creeping in from above, curling through the cracks, like curious fingers. Someone planted a fig tree too close to the wall again. You know this because you found one of the fruits, half rotten, still clinging to the tendril. Planned, designed with precision that still puzzles modern archaeologists. You've walked under arches stamped with the initials of consuls. You followed tunnels that slant just right to let gravity carry the waste downhill. All the way to the Tiber. You toss it aside and move on, because the work is never done. The 1st century CE, it is an invisible river. The engineers and the some private, all connected in ways the wealthy above don't like to think about. You couldn't read all of it to our Latin is functional. Not fluent, but the phrase "don't wait for me" was clear enough. Sewage, the foracae, are strange places. Long benches with carved holes. The worst danger, isnt, what you sit, s, what you can t. Black damp, a sudden lack of oxygen. You learn to watch the flame on your oil lamp. If it flickers oddly, you turn back. There's a small service tunnel, low, damp, and crowded with spiders. You've learned to listen for distant echoes on, unnatural hiss. A shift in the way your footsteps sound. Flushing the system. You've learned to listen for distant echoes and unnatural hiss. A shift in the way your footsteps sound. That means water is coming. Fast. You scoop debris with long poles. Trying not to think too hard about what it is. Spaced just far enough apart to encourage conversation. But close enough that everyone must be comfortable with everything. It's easy to forget that Rome's sewers were engineered. The Cloaca Maxima, the main artery, was originally an open-air canal, built by the Etruscan kings long before Caesar's name meant anything. No privacy. Later, the Romans roofed it with massive stone blocks, repurposing the channel to connect baths, fountains, and foracapublic toilets. By your time, you know it better than most. You've walked its entire laugh, argue, senators and merchants, bakers and beggars. Everyone visits eventually. Even the emperor, supposedly, once sat in a public latrine to show he wasn't above the people. Length constantly. More than once, from the Subura district down to the river's edge, where the water opens its mouth into the Tiber. On a quiet day, you can stand at the final outlet and watch the city's secrets vanish into the current. Toilets and latrines, Rome's social hubs. You've been assigned to clean many latrines, some public. The public ones, there are no dividers. People chat, water flows underneath. Cleaners like you enter from the back. Sometimes people drop things, rings, coins, even letters. You once found a wax tablet covered in hurried writing, addressed to someone named Cassia. You wiped it clean and set it aside. Someone else's goodbye. The hazards of the job. There are worse jobs in Rome, but few are as risky. In the tightest tunnels, air can go stale. Then there's the water itself. Rome's sewers were designed to flood during heavy rain, flushing the system. More than one foricarius has vanished in a sudden swell, swept out to the Tiber before anyone knew they were missing. That's why you wear the rope, and why you only go alone when absolutely necessary. Pay, pride, and the smell of clean. You are paid, technically, a small wage, handed out in bronze coins every 5th day. Just enough for bread, beans, maybe a flask of watered wine. You know all the hidden entrances to the city's infrastructure. That makes you useful, but you also trade. Soap for news, olives for favors. Some even respect you quietly. A merchant once paid you extra to retrieve a ring that had fallen through a bath drain. You found it in the sludge, soaked it in vinegar, and left it on a clean cloth. For a moment, it cuts through everything, and you remember what clean smells like. He never looked you in the eye, but he paid in silver. You still have that coin, too. Not official ones, just those passed along by the older men. Sometimes, when you're above ground and the wind is right, you catch the scent of fresh laurel or baked bread. It's not perfume or incense, it's absence, a stillness, a city functioning exactly as it should. Rituals and superstitions. There are certain rules you follow down here, and you've seen things, statues buried in mud, forgotten shrines behind sealed grates, bones too old to name. Never speak a name aloud underground. Always tap the wall 3 times before entering a new tunnel. But smaller neighborhood baths use the same water network. Cold in, hot out, waste away. You maintain the final step. If you hear a whisper and there's no one with you, don't answer. A man soaking in warm water, trusting that the drain works. You don't question these rules. Not because you believe them exactly, but because the tunnels are older than you. Older than Rome, some say. The city buries its past, sometimes on purpose. You let it lie. Not because they're cleaner, but because they remind you that somewhere above, people are relaxing. A hairline crack runs through it now, growing longer each week. You'll report it to your overseer. It won't be fixed soon. bathhouses, and runoff mysteries. Some of your work connects with the thermi, the public baths, not the grand ones, with gilded ceilings and statues of Apollo. Those are maintained by palace engineers. Here, the runoff smells different, like oil and herbs, rosemary, lavender, and sometimes something floral you can't quite name. You like these jobs. That's what civilization is, after all, because you're there, unseen. Now, it's nearly evening. The tunnels grow quieter, the footfalls above are fewer. In the distance, you hear a theater bell, perhaps the start of a play. You take a final look at the brickwork near the Porta Trigemina, but it will be fixed eventually, because Rome, for all its grandeur, is a city of maintenance, held up by workers like you. And still, a question drips through your mind, like water through limestone. If a city forgets who cleans its sewers, what else has it forgotten? The morning after a festival is always the worst. The city glitters with leftover garlands. Bits of crushed fruit litter the pavement. Someone has overturned a wine cart in the Suburra, again purple stains, bleeding into the cracks like bruises. But below, in the underbelly of empire, it's just another day, another shift, another wheelbarrow of discarded luxury. You brace your shoulder against the service door, push it open with a creak, and descend once more into the dark, cool breath of the Cloaca Maxima. This is your third decade doing this work, and the tunnels still have new things to show you. The layers beneath you've grown old in these halls. Not old by age, your bones still hold, but old by wear, by familiarity. You know the tunnels better than some priests know their temples. There are places down here the maps don't mark anymore. Shortcuts, dead ends, rooms with purposes forgotten long ago. Stonework changes suddenly, from Republican-era bricks to later, more refined imperial marble reinforcements. The sound changes too. Certain tunnels echo higher. Others muffle your steps like wool. You know where the bats live, where the heat rises from an underground spring, warming the ceiling like a breath from the gods. You know where the tunnels hum not from water, but from the vibration of life above. Rome doesn't sleep, it pulses, and you walk beneath its heartbeat. Ghosts. In the water, every sewer worker has stories. The girl who wanders the Suburra drain, looking for a coin she dropped before the fire. The engineer who vanished into a collapsed tunnel near the Forum. His voice, they say, still whispers to warn others. You don't believe in ghosts. Not really, but you walk a little faster past that junction, all the same. Still not all that's hidden is imagined. There are Roman mosaics in tunnels no longer used. You once found one black tiles forming a dolphin's tail, barely visible, under layers of lime and soot. Who built it? Who saw it last? Why decorate a tunnel? No one knows. That's the thing about the underground. It holds Rome's memory better than the marble above, the smell of power. You've been assigned to the palace. Drains twice. You entered through a hidden arch near the Palatine Hill, crawling on your knees through a damp tunnel. The waste smelled different, oiled, expensive. You once found peach pits near the drainage grill, peaches in January, and fish bones, too, from something clearly not caught in the Tiber. The waste of the powerful is not cleaner, only ... silt, more perfumed. You removed a small clog of grape stems and bits of rose petal. Somewhere above, a banquet had been held. There had been laughter, toasts, platters of rare delights. Below, You cleared the leftovers from a pipe no one else would ever see, and for a moment you wondered, was this what it meant to support an empire? The future of your workroom keeps growing. New sewers are being dug in the Trans-Tiberim district. The aqueducts are branching farther. New homes, new temples, new theaters, but the old cloaca still flows. They say one day it will be replaced, that modern tunnels with brick vaults and iron grates will take its place, that waste will flow more cleanly, more efficiently. You've heard this before, but deep down you know the new always stands on the old. It is not a replacement. It is a continuation. Someone will always need to walk the dark halls. Someone will always smell what Rome would rather forget. Maybe it won't be your son. He's apprenticing as a mason now. His hands stay dry, but someone's child will take your place. Some boy with a shovel, a rope, and a tolerance for shadows. Recognition in stone. You once asked your overseer, half joking, if sewer workers ever got statues. He laughed, said there was a marble bust in Ostia of a man holding a rake. He might have been one of us. You've never seen it. You suspect it doesn't exist. Still, some mornings you imagine a statue, not of an emperor or a general, not of a poet or a god, just a man in a hood, holding a shovel, his boots worn smooth. No plaque, no title, just a figure in stone, acknowledged, a final walk you've taken to walking the tunnels slower these days. Your knees creak, your lamp burns lower, but there's a peace to it, the kind that comes only with repetition, with knowing you've kept something alive without praise or reward, because that's what the cloaca is, really, not a sewer, a promise that waste will flow, that life will continue, that someone, somewhere, is willing to do the dull, difficult thing that keeps civilization from rotting at its edges. That someone was you, that someone is still you, above. A fountain gurgles in the forum. A boy tosses in a coin and makes a wish below. You keep walking, and you wonder, what would Rome become if no one stayed behind to clean up after it? Imagine a city built on a lake, not beside it, not overlooking it on it. A city with temples taller than ships' masts, causeways stretching like arms through shallow water, and canals instead of streets. This is Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire in the early 15th century. You've arrived at dawn. The air is cool, soft with mist, and smells faintly of flowers and damp earth. You're here to visit the Chinampas floating gardens, but don't let the word floating fool you. These gardens don't drift or bob like rafts. They are anchored, firm, lush, and vast, fields built on water, and the men and women who tend them, gardeners, engineers, caretakers of empire, have created something as ingenious as any aqueduct or temple. This is the story of how the Aztecs grew tomatoes, chilies, beans, and corn in places where no soil was meant to grow. The city on the Lake Tenochtitlan sat at the center of Lake Texcoco, a shallow, brackish lake in the Valley of Mexico. The lake wasn't exactly ideal farmland. Its waters were salty in places, and the dry season floods could be unpredictable. But the Aztecs were persistent and inventive. When land ran out, they made more. They didn't just extend the city with canals and piers. They turned the lake itself into farmland, using bundles of reeds, mud dredged from the lake bed, and stakes made from willow trees. They formed long rectangular platforms chinampos where plants could grow as if they were. In open soil, the lake fed the roots from below. The sun kissed the leaves from above. And the people of Tenochtitlan never went hungry, or at least rarely did. Building a chinampu, walk along a narrow canal path, past a man in a reed canoe, pulling up sacks of lake mud. He nods and gestures ahead, where to gardeners are building a new chinampa from scratch. First, they drive stakes into the lake bed, marking out a rectangle typically about 30 meters long and 2 or 3 meters wide. Then they begin weaving mats of reeds between the stakes, forming a loose basket that holds in the mud. With baskets in place, they bring up the lakebed soil, rich in nutrients and soft with silt, and heap it in layers over the frame. On top of that, they add compost kitchen scraps, fish bones, even human waste from city latrines, which was collected and transported to the fields by canoe. Finally, they plant willow saplings along the edges. In a few months, the roots will grow down and anchor the entire structure to the lakebed. The willows also provide shade, firewood, and living fences. From this, an artificial island is born. It will never be walked on in sandals, only barefoot or with care, because the earth is spongy and alive. But it will grow everything what they grow. Chinampas could yield multiple harvests per year, far more than most traditional fields. They weren't just clever, they were efficient. Here's what you might see growing in one glance. Tomatoes, small, sweet, orange-red varieties clinging to upright stakes. Chili peppers, delicate plants, thin-stemmed, their fruits turning from green to deep red. Maize corn, towering plants, forming a spine through the middle of the chinampa. Amaranth, a grain with tiny edible seeds and leaves used like spinach. Squash, wide leaves spreading at the edges, their golden blossoms curling in the sun. Beans, climbing up the maize, intertwining in a three sisters method known to many indigenous farmers across the Americas. And herbs, epazote, cilantro, wild garlic, all growing together in a micro-ecosystem, carefully maintained with wooden paddles and quiet footsteps. Tomatoes, in particular, loved the chinampa system. The warm, wet roots, the airy stems, they grew in clusters, sometimes for harvests a year. The Aztecs dried them, stewed them, mashed them into sauces with chilies and salt. They were considered everyday food, too ordinary to celebrate, but too essential to forget. A floating marketplace near the edge of the city. The Tlatelolco market bustles even before noon from the chinampas. Farmers paddle narrow, canoes laden with baskets of vegetables, herbs, and flowers. Tomatoes are sold by the handful, measured not in weight, but in bundles of equal size. Chilies are separated by heat and color. Fresh maize is stacked in neat pyramids. There are no coins. Goods are traded by count, by arrangement, by need. One man trades 2 baskets of squash blossoms for a woven cloak. Another gives a stone knife in exchange for dried amaranth and a small pouch of tomato salt. The tomatoes go into stews, tamales, ceremonial offerings. The cooks in noble houses send boys to the market daily for the freshest ones. No one calls it revolutionary, because to them, it's just farming. Walking the borders as you walk along the edge of the chinampa fields, dragonflies buzz lazily in the reeds, egrets perch silently in the willows. The air is warm, but never heavy. The water reflects everything's sky, clouds, temple towers far in the distance. The gardeners work in silence, mostly. A hum here, a short whistle to signal another boat. They are brown-skinned, sunburnt, barefoot, their hands permanently marked by lake soil and willow bark. You notice they rarely speak to their plants. They listen instead. They know the signs of poor water, of overgrown algae, of salt creeping in from the wrong canal. They measure the world not in time, but in cycles of floods and harvests, bird migrations and flower blooms. One gardener shows you a tomato vine whose leaves have curled. He nods slowly, mutters something about too much ash in the compost, and snips the leaf cleanly. You ask what he'll do next. He smiles, shrugs, and replies, "Wait and see what the vine says tomorrow." As the day stretches on and the shadows grow longer across the water, you sit beneath a willow and watch the gardeners at work, and you wonder how many empires fall because they forget to listen to their tomatoes. The canoe rocks gently as you paddle down the narrow canal on either side. Chinampas stretch in low, leaf-covered rows, their borders framed by whispering willows and neat piles of cut reeds. The air is warm, but not unpleasant, damp with life. You're riding with Tochtli, a gardener whose family has worked these fields for generations. His name means rabbit, though he moves with the patience of a tortoise slow. Deliberate, unhurried, he's taking you deeper today, past the popular plots near the causeways, into the older gardens, the ones his grandfather called the ghost fields. Plants grow better, Tochtli says, when the soil remembers your name. The floating archive, these chinampas, aren't marked on any map. They're smaller, more irregular. Some are little more than hunched islands of tangled squash and maize. But these are the most fertile ones. The soil here has been dredged and renewed, over and overlayered with mud, compost, charcoal, and memory. Tochtli stops the canoe and gestures to a corner of one plot. He pulls up a small, twisted stalk, a tomato plant, he says, that grew here before the last war. You blink. Surely he exaggerates, but the way he tends it, carefully slicing back a dead vine, dusting a handful of crushed oyster shell into the root base, suggests something else. Of old, successful plant-saving seeds, yes, but also cuttings, tiny root balls wrapped in red fiber and stored in baskets. These heirloom cuttings are handed down, replanted, and, as they say, remembered. The soil doesn't just feed the tomatoes, it knows them, composting without waste. You ask how the chinampas stay fertile without manure from large animals. The answer is surprisingly organized. The Aztec capital had a system for human waste collection. Households were expected to store waste in sealed clay pots, which were collected by canoe, much like garbage trucks today. The contents were ferried out to the chinampas, where they were mixed with other compost materials. Night soil, crushed bones from fish and birds, ashes from hearth fires, rotten food from markets, algae pulled from stagnant water canals, feathers, eggshells, and even powdered insects. This dark, rich mixture was folded into the top layer of the beds by hand. Over time, it created a living compost network that could feed the same garden beds indefinitely. Tochtli shows you his compost pit. It smells earthy, not foul. When he lifts a woven lid, steam curls into the air. You feed the earth, he says. and it feeds you back. Natural pesticides and plant medicine, no chemical sprays, no irrigation pumps, no steel tools, and yet the chinampas flourish. You learn that the gardeners use teas brewed from wild plants to discourage pests, epazote for repelling ants, chili water to drive off beetles, crushed marigold petals to prevent mold. They also companion plant certain herbs that confuse insects or attract beneficial ones. Basil grows near tomatoes, not for flavor, but for defense. A strip of garlic chives runs along a canal edge. Its strong scent discourages egg flies. When plants fall ill, the gardeners don't panic. They observe, adjust, wait. A gardener might move a sick tomato plant to a new chinampa for recovery, like convalescent care. Sometimes it survives, sometimes it doesn't. But it's always given a chance. Labor and ownership. The chinampas are not free for anyone to use. They belong to Kalpula clan or neighborhood groups responsible for tending the land and sharing its yield. Each gardener is assigned a section to maintain. Some plots are passed down within families. Others are allocated by the Tlatoani local leader to ensure balance. Women often tend the gardens closest to the city, especially those with herb beds and flower plots. Men manage the larger fields farther out, paddling in each morning before the sun reaches its highest point. Children help too, chasing birds, collecting compost, learning which plants need shade and which need song. The work is not just manual, it is spiritual. At planting time, gardeners offer cornmeal, cocoa powder, or drops of pulque fermented agave to the earth, not as superstition, but as thanks. You're reminded again, to the Aztecs, farming wasn't survival, it was a sacred rhythm. Tomatoes at the Tempelat, the Templo Mayor, the heart of Tenochtitlan. They were offerings during ceremonies to Zip Totec, the god of renewal. Baskets of tomatoes were placed alongside maize and chilies at the temple base. Priests used red tomato juice to anoint ritual tools. In one surviving codex illustration, a bowl of chopped tomatoes is labeled the blood of the garden. Tochtli says his uncle once delivered such a basket tied with braided reed and fresh basil leaves. He still talks about it, not because he saw the gods that day, but because his tomatoes made it to the top of the steps. In the city, Tochtli tells you, some pray with incense, we pray with flavor. Pulls the canoe gently back toward the main canal. You pass chinampas, glowing gold in the last light, leaves rustling. Willows dipping low. As frogs croak softly in the reeds. Have been fed not by conquest or coin, but by the quiet work of gardeners who simply paid attention. You wake before sunrise to the sounds of paddles slapping gently on water. A procession of canoes, barely visible in the pre-dawn mist, glides across the canals like shadows. Each carries baskets, tools, and gardeners wrapped in cotton cloaks. Others say nothing. The day begins with ritual stillness. This morning, you'll help with harvest. The tomato vines are thick with fruit, small, sun-warmed orbs in shades of orange, crimson, and gold. They aren't perfectly round. Some are bulbous, others narrow, like teardrops, but each is firm, fragrant, and alive with flavor. You crouch with Tochtli beside a chinampa row, your fingers brushing the damp stems. It's easy to believe, in this moment, that nothing here could ever end. But this story, like all empires, has a shadow. before the ships came at its peak. The Chinampa network surrounding Tenochtitlan produced enough food to feed hundreds of thousands of people. It was so efficient that surplus vegetables were stored, dried, or traded with neighboring regions. The tomato, once a wild vine in the hills of Mesoamerica, had become a staple of imperial cuisine. It flavored tamales, stews, and maize cakes. It was crushed into spicy sauces with chili and ground pumpkin seeds, or dried and mixed with beans for soldiers to carry on campaign. But these were the last years of peace. By the early 16th century, strange ships were appearing on the eastern coasts. Their men brought new metals, animals, languages, and diseases the Aztecs had never seen. Within a few short years, Tenochtitlan would fall, the canals would clog with rubble, the temples would burn, and the Chinampas, the silent, floating gardens, would begin to vanish from the memory of the world. But not all of them. Tomatoes. Across the ocean, the Spanish conquerors did not understand Chinampas, but they noticed the tomatoes. They tasted them in stews, saw them in the markets, called them tomatel, borrowing the Nahuatl word. Some wrote in letters to the crown that these fruits were oddly red, juicy, and useful in sauces. Tomato seeds had crossed the Atlantic. In Europe, they were grown in monastery gardens, often for ornament more than food. The fruit was met with suspicion, its red color unsettling, its stem and leaves resembling the nightshade plant. For years, tomatoes were believed to be poisonous, but slowly they made their way into Italian kitchens, Spanish stews, and Portuguese trade ships. The tomato adapted, changed, crossed borders and languages. It left behind its origin, and its origin was mostly forgotten. The Chinampa lives on Tenochtitlan, was conquered, but it didn't vanish entirely. The Spanish rebuilt atop it, naming the new city Mexico City. The canals were gradually drained or filled. The temples were dismantled, stone by stone. But in a few places, the Chinampas remained quiet, stubborn, enduring to this day. In the district of Xochimilco, a small patchwork of Chinampas still operates. The farmers rise early, as they always did. They paddle their wooden boats, plant maize, beans, chilies, and yes, tomatoes. Their techniques haven't changed much. Their tools are still wood and red. Their compost pits still steam in the morning light. Some of the tomatoes grown here are direct descendants of those first Aztec vines passed down through families. Never industrialized, never forgotten, an underground heritage in recent years. Archaeologists and botanists have returned to the Chinampas, curious to study their resilience. They found something surprising. The soil was still alive. Even after centuries of neglect, it was rich in microbial life, capable of growing crops without fertilizer or modern irrigation. The layered compost, lake mud, and root systems had created something rare, self-regenerating farmland. Scientists now see Chinampas as a model for sustainable agriculture, a system that feeds many with few resources, a living example of circular farming perfected long before the industrial age. And yet most of the world still doesn't know. They eat tomatoes in ketchup, pizza, soup, and salad without realizing they're tasting the legacy of lake gardens, tended by barefoot farmers with obsidian knives and red canoes. Your final morning on the Chinampa, the sun is fully risen. The tomato baskets are full. Tochtli ties his bundle with a strip of palm fiber and loads it gently into the canoe. You help him push off from the Chinampa's muddy edge. The canoe drifts forward, quiet and smooth. Dragonflies dart overhead. Behind you, the garden waits, half wild, half tamed, entirely sacred. Tochtli doesn't say goodbye, he simply nods. His work, like the lake, has no beginning or end. You stand at the shore a while longer, breathing in the scent of water, compost, and ripening fruit. And you wonder, how much knowledge do we lose each time we mistake simplicity for ignorance? You arrive in the year 1378, in the heart of the Kingdom of France. The 100 Years' War has paused briefly, and a certain quiet unease has settled over the countryside, like mist after battle. The castle of Château de Villenois, modest by royal standards, yet formidable in stone, sits atop a low hill. Its gray towers rise from the earth like forgotten teeth. The moat is shallow now, more decorative than defensive. But the walls, those still mean business. You're here to observe a curious episode. A knightser, Gibbert of Auxerre, loyal vassal, skilled swordsman, and devout listener of Gregorian chants, has vanished. Not in battle, not in the forest, but somewhere inside his own castle. For 7 entire days, Sir Gibbert was believed to have left on pilgrimage. In truth, he was trapped in a forgotten wing, meandering through storerooms, servant corridors, and spiral staircases that led nowhere. This is not a tale of heroism. It is a tale of architecture, pride, poor signage, and a knight who just wanted to find the library. The maze of medieval castles, contrary to what modern films might show. Medieval castles were not always symmetrical, logical, or even navigable. They were built in stages, over generations. A 12th century dungeon might later be expanded with a 13th century chapel, followed by a 14th century annex of storerooms and a crumbling garderobe tower no one has bothered to demolish. At Château de Villenois, the inner keep had at least 4 staircases. 2 went up, 1 doubled back halfway. The last lead, inexplicably, to the ceiling of the kitchen, where steam warped the oak panels and startled passing cooks. Corridors were unlit. Arched thresholds shifted height without warning. Rooms were numbered, if at all based on old family names. Lady Aveline's upper solar, Jean of Milk's loft, third pantry of Brother Renewal. And the doors, some were only 5 feet tall, requiring even average men to duck. Others opened into stone walls. One, still inexplicably, opened into another door. You begin to understand how Sir Gibbert's simple errandom morning walk to borrow a book of Saints Good turned into a week-long disappearance. Sir Gibbert's first wrong turn, the second day of Advent. Gibbert woke early, recited his prayers, and set off toward the lower library. He sought a slim, cracked volume, Vita Sancti Alquinitha, Life of Saint Alcuin. A quiet morning, ideal for study. But he took a left instead of a right. This led him into the north storehouse, filled with bolts of wool, pickled turnips, and crates of dried fish. Not one to admit error, Gibbert pressed on, convinced there must be a passage out. There was. But it opened into the servants' drying gallery, which, thanks to recent snow, was hung with 30 wet cloaks, rendering visibility to near zero. He called out, but the stone walls swallowed his voice. By the time he realized he was alone, he had already passed into a servants' corridor, narrow, dark, and winding like a bad memory. Why no one noticed the disappearance of a knight was serious business under normal circumstances, But Sir Gibbert, while respected, had a reputation for sudden silences. He often took solitary fasts or spent afternoons in the chapel crypt contemplating mortality. Once, he spent 3 days in the pigeon loft, reciting Latin aloud to improve their moral character. So, when he failed to appear at supper that night, the steward merely assumed he was in prayer. By day 3, most believed he had departed on an unannounced pilgrimage. His horse was missing, a groom had taken it for watering, and his traveling cloak, hung behind a tapestry, had not been seen. Meanwhile, Gibbert was camped beside a stack of old grain sacks in the Upper East Garrison cloister, surviving on hard biscuits left for mice and rainwater seeping through the stones. He still had the lantern he'd lit before leaving. The oil ran out on the 4th night. The roll of spiral staircases, one of the great architectural features of medieval castles, is the spiral staircase, always built clockwise, going up. This gave advantage to right-handed defenders, coming down with swords. What it didn't do, however, was make sense to Gibbert, who descended 3 floors, thinking he was ascending. At one point, he emerged into the chapel choir loft, startling a monk into spilling a pitcher of honeyed ale. But Gibbert had already wandered back down another stair before the monk could recognize him. This is how legends of ghosts begin. By day 5, the castle believed it haunted. Coping, the nightly Wegibert remained dignified, or tried to. He sharpened his dagger on a broken brick. He composed a sonnet now lost about spiritual patience. He used an old tapestry as a blanket and attempted to measure time by candle stubs. He swore, silently, never to ask for directions again. He also tried unsuccessfully to communicate by tapping on pipes. Unfortunately, what he believed to be a ventilation duct was, in fact, the flue for the kitchen oven. The cooks assumed the rhythmic thumping was a squirrel. They threw potatoes at the ceiling and went on with their day. By night 6, Sir Gibbert sat on a dusty stool, staring at the unmoving shadows, wondering, if a man gets lost in his own home, is it his fault, or the architect's? Sir Gibbert of Auxerre had not bathed in 6 days. His armor left off in a forgotten corridor on day 2 was somewhere beneath a pile of moth-eaten tapestries. His once white tunic was now the color of porridge, and his right boot had developed an audible squelch thanks to a leaky drain, but his pride still intact. Because on the morning of day 7, Gibbert resolved not to escape his accidental imprisonment, but to re-emerge with dignity. This section is not about rescue. It's about survival, strategy, and how a man armed only with a dagger, a stale biscuit, and a head full of chivalric poetry began to navigate his own castle like an invader. In enemy territory, inventory of a misplaced knight. Let's review what Gibbert had in his possession. 1 blunt dagger used to pry open a jammed door. 2 Ondehoff biscuits, originally packed for the library. Visit a copy of the Life of St. Alcuin, finally located. Ironically, in the grain closet, 1 coin misplaced during a nap in the hayloft, a small prayer book with water damage, half a wax candle, and a firm belief that he was being tested by God. He, Boo, also carried a wooden spoon, origin unclear, a sore shoulder from sleeping on stone, and an ongoing debate in his head about whether he could count this week toward penance. Mistaken identities. On the evening of day 4, Gibbert encountered a young servant girl while attempting to climb through a buttery window into a kitchen hall. She screamed, dropped her basket of turnips, and fled. The castle was now fully convinced. A ghost roamed the halls. The steward consulted the chaplain. A monk sprinkled rosemary water near the chapel. Bells were rung. A rooster was tethered at the gate to ward off spirits, all while Gibbert quietly tiptoed past the armory, holding his sandals in one hand to reduce noise. He never once thought to call for help. After all, what would he say? "Good evening. I live here. I'm just between staircases." Castle infrastructure. Uninspiring but effective. By day 5, Gibbert had begun charting his location, using candle soot on the stone walls. He devised a marking system: X for a known dead end, O for a food source, mice and biscuit crumbs, tilde for moisture, most corridors. Sadly, a crude drawing of a book for rooms that smelled like vellum. His map stretched across 5 separate storage chambers. The accuracy is questionable, as one of the rooms was later revealed to be the same corridor. Approached from a different angle, castles, especially those expanded over decades or centuries, often contained redundant passages. These were sometimes intentional secret routes for escape, or unintentional, caused by changing architectural priorities. To Gibbert, every door held possibility, and possibly soup. Personal reflections in isolation. By the end of day 6, Gibbert was having internal conversations with St. Alcuin. He asked questions aloud. Is it pride if one refuses rescue? Do saints ever misplace themselves? If I never leave, can I start charging rent? In the candlelit dark of a forgotten armory loft, he composed an entire verse cycle dedicated to stone, shadow, and silence. The rhymes were uneven, but heartfelt. His greatest worry wasn't that no one had found him, it was that no one had looked. The rediscovery. On the 7th morning, a chambermaid, searching for lost linens, stumbled upon Gibbert sitting on a barrel, eating a raw onion like an apple, and staring at a rat with philosophical interest. She screamed. He blinked. And then, in the most knightly voice he could muster, he said, "Tell the steward I have returned from deep inspection." Within hours, the castle buzzed with tales of Sir Gibbert's secret mission, possibly on behalf of the king. His story was unclear. He neither confirmed nor denied anything. He simply bathed, dressed, and requested a hearty meal and a quiet evening. By dusk, as Gibbert stood at the battlements, freshly shaven and sipping watered wine, he considered, if no one knew, you were lost. Were you truly missing? The next morning, the castle resumed its normal rhythm. Cooks returned to stewing eels. Grooms tended to restless horses. The steward composed new ledger notes, pretending nothing unusual had happened. But the tale of Sir Gibbert's temporary absence took on a life of its own, and Gibbert, he remained perfectly silent on the matter. After all, the easiest way to control a story is not to correct it. A knight's reputation reimagined within a fortnight. Rumors flourished like ivy. One tale claimed Gibbert had spent the week in secret vigil, praying in the deepest crypt of St. Hubert's Tower. Another suggested he was testing the loyalty of his retainers, an elaborate feudal audit disguised as absence. A third insisted he was hunting a ghost himself, perhaps the very spirit who'd startled the kitchen girl. Each tale was wilder than the last. Gibbert denied none of them. Instead, he began wearing a small leather pouch around his neck, from which he occasionally drew a cracked biscuit. A memento, he would say, from my trials. Only one person knew the truth. Brother Amandus, the castle's oldest monk, who once walked in on Gibbert emerging from a linen closet near the chapel, dusty and confused. Amandus never spoke of it, but every time Gibbert passed, he'd murmur, "Left at the stairs, next time, my lord." The castle's architectural audit Gibbert, to his quiet credit, did order some changes. A week after his return, a small team of masons was assigned to map the castle's interior. It took them 6 weeks, 4 near injuries, and 1 broken goose egg to produce a full layout. Among their discoveries, 3 separate staircases that led to the same pantry, a corridor that looped back into itself like a Mobius strip, 2 doors that opened into the same storage room from opposite sides, 1 spiral staircase that simply stopped mid-floor, with no landing, dubbed the Disappointment Tower. Gibbert had small iron plaques placed near the worst offenders. "No exit. Here be barrels. Sir Gibbert was here." The last one became oddly popular with visiting nobles. Legacy in lantern light years later. Younger knights would whisper about the week Sir Gibbert vanished. A few even staged imitation quests, locking themselves in the castle's upper towers with biscuits and a candle to see how long they could go undetected. One lad lasted 11 hours before confessing to the steward. Another managed 2 days before falling asleep in the dovecote and being pooped on by 27 pigeons. None matched the original tale, because none had the accidental elegance of Sir Gibbert's ordeal, the unplanned path, the stubborn silence, the perfect reappearance with clean hands and no apology. The irony of immortality. Gibbert's later life was quiet. He retired to a small estate on the Loire, where he bred modest war horses and gave tedious lectures on door hinge maintenance. He died in 1411, surrounded by confused nephews and 1 loyal manservant who had memorized the castle's entire layout just in case. He was buried with honor beneath a simple stone, but in the great hall of Château de Villenois, his tale lived on. A painted tapestry commissioned, anonymously depicted Gibbert seated nobly in a narrow hallway, holding a candle in one hand and a biscuit in the other. The caption read, "The knight who knew every turn, eventually." And as the fire crackles low in the hearth, and the stone walls whisper with old drafts and forgotten footsteps, you might ask yourself, how many legends are born not from victory, but from getting thoroughly, gloriously lost? You are standing on the open steppe. The horizon stretches in every direction, vast brown-gold grasslands, touched by the morning sun. The wind is constant, but never cruel. It carries with it the faint scent of horse sweat, campfire smoke, and warm milk. There are no cities here, no ports, no walls, no taverns, and yet, in the early 13th century, this wind-swept emptiness was the nervous system of one of the largest land empires in history. You're in the heart of the Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous empire ever built. It stretched from the edge of the Pacific to the plains of Hungary, and what held it together across mountains, deserts, and languages wasn't just armies, it was mail. More specifically, the YAM system, a horse-powered, meticulously organized relay network of mounted couriers, stations, maps, and codes. This story is not about conquest. It is about how messages moved, how a single note from Genghis Khan could cross thousands of miles without faltering, and how the Mongols turned communication into conquest's most reliable ally. Birth of the Yamtha. Yam, pronounced Yam, means checkpoint or post station in Mongolian. The idea was simple: to rule a vast empire, you need information, fast, reliable. You cannot wait weeks for scouts to return, or messengers to find their way across unmarked plains. So, under the rule of Genghis Khan in the early 1200s, the empire established its first dedicated relay network. Every 25 to 30 miles, there would be a yam station, a modest outpost with fresh horses, spare tack, provisions, and shelter. Messengers would arrive, dismount, hand off the message, or continue on with a fresh horse, and ride to the next station, and so on, for thousands of miles. Some estimates suggest over 10,000 stations eventually dotted the empire. This was not just fast for the Middle Ages, it rivaled the speed of some 19th century systems. A message could travel from Karakoram in Mongolia to Baghdad in under 2 weeks. What the yam stations looked like: you arrive at a yam station just after sunset. It is simple: no walls, just a wooden corral, a low yurt, and a stone hearth that glows with embers. The air smells of fermented mare's milk arag. 3 horses stand under a rough canopy, already saddled. The station master, a wiry man with a beard like broom straw, nods as a courier rides in. The rider is dust-caked, silent, focused. He tosses a sealed leather packet into the master's hands and takes a drink from a ladle. Within minutes, he's off again with a new horse, galloping west into the dusk. The packet, marked with Genghis Khan's personal seal, will not stop. Not for snow, nor bandits, nor rivers. The Mongols built bridges. They cut paths through forests. They even stationed boats where rivers needed crossing. Each yam station was part of a living timed tract and staffed who could use the system. The yam wasn't open to everyone. Only authorized messengers carried the pesa, bronze or gold tablet inscribed with imperial authority. This was your passport, your access key, your badge. With it, you could demand food, shelter, even replacement horses from local villagers or noble houses. There were different levels of pesa, some more powerful than others. The highest ranking messengers traveled with imperial protection. To delay one was to risk severe punishment. Even Marco Polo, when traveling under Mongol service, described the efficiency of the yam in glowing terms. He compared it to the Roman system, though admitted the Mongols did it faster. What they carried, the messages, varied. Military orders, reports from scouts, trade agreements, invitations to foreign diplomats, instructions for governors in distant cities, notes from khans to family members or generals stationed thousands of miles away. Most messages were oral, memorized and recited word for word at each stop. Others were written on paper or birch bark, sometimes wrapped in silk. In particularly sensitive cases, messages were burned after reading. Couriers were trained to memorize not just words, but tone. It mattered how a khan's message was spoken: firm, kind, impatient, warning. A slip of tone could shift a treaty or start a war. Training. The yam couriers were not ordinary riders. They were specialists. From a young age, they learned to ride without reins, using their knees to steer. They trained to shoot while galloping, to deliver messages in foul weather, to track stars at night. Each was expected to ride 120 to 150 kilometers a day. Some rode more. A few, in emergencies, could ride day and night, stopping only to switch horses, They carried dried meat, hardened cheese, and salt in pouches. They memorized maps, routes, and passwords. Many had 2 or 3 languages: Mongolian, Turkic, Persian, even a bit of Chinese or Russian. And they were taught one thing above all: the message is more important than you. As you sit beside the yam station's low fire, the night settles in, the stars bloom over the steppe bright, cold, and countless. Another rider arrives, another departs. The wind never stops, and you wonder how many wars were won not by sword or siege but by a quiet rider passing in the dark with a folded note beneath his tunic. It's nearing sunrise, and the light on the steppe is pale and pink. You're traveling now, not resting, riding beside a Mongol courier named Timur, whose name means iron. He doesn't speak unless necessary. His eyes scan the terrain. He smells rain before it comes. He hums, sometimes, under his breath, songs about camels, clouds, and girls with strong shoulders. You're between stations, riding what's known as a wing route, a side trail connecting the main yam spine to a distant outpost. These wing routes spiderweb out from the empire's backbone, carrying not just news, but life, because where yam couriers went, so did culture, trade, language, and rumor. The network beneath the empire, the Mongol postal system, didn't just follow the military. It shaped the geography of the empire. Yam routes followed the Silk Roads, but were sometimes faster, riskier, or more direct. They crossed deserts using hidden oases. They wove through the Tian Shan and Altai mountains using passes only locals knew. Where there were no roads, the Mongols made roads by riding them until the path became real. There were coded markers along many yam routes, bundles of tied grass indicating turnoffs, carved stones etched with runic signs, piles of horse dung intentionally placed to mark safe fords or river crossings to outsiders. The landscape looked empty, but to a yam courier it was a map, one written in hoofprints, dust, and habit, but with everything a courier might need: leather harnesses, spare girths, and saddles, butter and dried meat for food, blankets and sheepskin coats for the cold, fire-starting kits made from flint and char cloth. Fresh horses, rotated regularly, some for speed, some for endurance. Local villagers were often responsible for supporting nearby stations. In exchange, they were protected from raids and paid in goods or tax relief. This meant the yam wasn't just a military tool, it was a social contract between state and citizen. If a station lacked food, the next one sent supplies. If a horse fell ill, its replacement came from the neighboring herd. The yam was self-repairing. The couriers, Kaditmer tells you, at last, a story. One winter, a courier was assigned to carry a message from Samarkand to Chang'an, a journey of over 4,000 kilometers. 3 weeks into the ride, he was injured in a storm and lost his horse in a river crossing. But he did not stop. He walked 3 days to the next station, refused aid, took a fresh mount, finished the journey, delivering the message by reciting it from memory. As the paper had dissolved in water, the message was a grain shipment approval, not a war order, not a royal decree, but still it arrived. This was the yam code. Failing the message meant failing the empire. Espionage and secrets on the route. Not every message carried by the yam was straightforward. Some were encrypted, simple codes known only to high-ranking officers. Others were carried in duplicate to prevent interception. Occasionally, couriers carried false messages as bait, while real ones followed by different routes. Some yam riders doubled as spies, trained to observe troop movements, food prices, or harbor activity. Their reports were slipped into innocuous notes and sent back. West Timor admits without detail that he once carried a message sewn inside a goat hide boot, disguised as a gift for a distant Khan. The goat, he adds dryly, was the least suspicious part of the mission. Foreign eyes on the European envoys, Persian scribes, and Chinese diplomats all noted the Yam system with admiration and, often, concern. John of Plano Carpini, a 13th century Franciscan envoy, wrote that messages in this land fly faster than birds. Marco Polo described stations with fresh horses every 25 miles, enough to supply 10,000 riders if needed. Even the Mamluks of Egypt, bitter enemies of the Mongols, acknowledged the uncanny precision of the empire's communication. The yam made war faster, but it also made diplomacy more flexible, trade more stable, and rebellion harder to hide. No peasant uprising could gain momentum before a courier's report reached the capital. As your horse crests a low ridge, the next station appears to yurts in a grove of white birch, smoke rising gently from a cooking fire. Timur dosen tea slow. He tosses you a water skin and points east. One more ride, he says. One more message. And you wonder how many messages were never redelivered. Yes, but lost to time, their importance known only to the horse, the wind, and the rider who never slowed down. You wake to the sound of hooves, not hurried, but rhythmic. The station is quiet. Timur is already gone. He left before dawn, carrying his final message, which you never saw, in a scroll case tucked beneath his coat. You sip warm milk from a clay bowl and watch the steppe bathed in gold. But time moves forward. Empires do not last forever, not even the ones that gallop. This section is about what happens when a perfect system begins to fray, and what pieces remain long after its riders are gone. After Genghis, keeping the yam alive. The brilliance of the yam didn't die with Genghis Khan. It was expanded by his descendants, particularly Gedai Khan and later Kublai Khan, who used the system to rule the Yuan dynasty in China. Under Kublai, the yam was fitted to Chinese infrastructure. Odes were paved, bridges fortified, and metal paises engraved with Mongol Chinese characters. Even foreigners could access it. Tiff trusted. Merchants from Venice, Persia, and India used the system to move letters, goods, and news across borders with astonishing speed. One Venetian merchant claimed to send a message from the Caspian Sea to Beijing in just 23 days, but slowly, inevitably, the system began to weaken, and it wasn't sabotage or invasion that broke it. It was overuse. When everyone wants a passes, the empire expanded. So did its bureaucracy. More officials, more governors, more courtiers. Everyone wanted a paisive, the small gold or bronze tablet that granted yam privileges, and many got them. By the late 13th century, thousands of unauthorized riders were using the system. Tax collectors, local nobles, merchants, envoys, even wandering monks. Horses were overworked. Stations ran out of supplies. Villagers, once honored to serve, began to hide their food and animals from yam agents. One historian called it death by favoritism. When too many people share a privilege, it ceases to be one. Silk, spies, and the price of speed. The yam was still used in the 14th century, but now its edges were worn. Courier stations in Persia were attacked by bandits who realized they often carried unmarked gold coins for wages. Horses were stolen. Messages disappeared. Some stations, once reliable, began taking bribes to delay or reroute letters. Still, the system worked, barely. It moved information faster than any rival state. But each ride was riskier, each relay slower. Some routes became impassable in bad weather, and no one came to fix the bridges. The yam had grown too large to maintain, and behind it, the empire itself was beginning to split. The empire fractures by the mid-1300s. The Mongol Empire had fractured into 4 khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde in Russia. Each ran its own version of the yam. But without central control, the consistency disappeared. Messages between khanates were delayed or mistrusted. Horses were no longer shared across borders. Paises lost their authority unless issued by the right khan, and then came the Black Death. By 1350, the plague had disrupted trade, travel, and communication across Eurasia. Yam stations emptied. Routes fell silent. Riders died or stopped riding. The empire that once whispered to itself across mountains and deserts had gone quiet. What was left behind centuries passed, but the ghosts of the yam remain in Russian courier networks, which borrowed its relay model in Persian record-keeping, which adapted its route documentation in the silk-bound maps stored in Chinese archives, still marked with yam station symbols, even in the word yam itself, which appears in Turkic languages as a term for messengers. Modern Mongolia has reintroduced postal horses in rural areas, small homages to the past. And somewhere near the old capital of Karakoram, archaeologists have found the ruins of a yam station, worn stone, bits of iron tack, the outline of a corral, no bones, but many hoofprints. The last ride. You imagine Timur, old now, riding the steppe. Alone, his peza hangs from a cord, its lettering worn smooth. His horse is slower, but steady. He stops one night near a ruined yam station, lights a fire, eats hard cheese, feeds his mount. Then, before sleeping, he removes a small scroll from his coat. It contains no orders, no secrets, just a letter to his son in a far-off valley about clouds and strong shoulders, and the time he rode across the empire for 7 days without a single word going missing. And you wonder, what if the greatest monuments of history are not made of stone, but of systems that worked, then vanished, like messages on the wind?